And just checking quickly. Or you could see that as well, potentially, if you have. Normally takes like a 10-15 seconds before it goes live. Let me just check. Yep. Yeah, I think we are. Yes, perfect. So awesome. We are super excited to be here. I welcome you all to this wonderful session in which we bring industry professionals into this live AI workshop. And what we try to do in these workshops is to give you visibility into what is the latest and the greatest tools and techniques people are using to enhance this field of data. And today I have with me Avesta. She's Avesta Rastan. She's a professional. And actually, it's an interesting story I can tell you guys. A few months ago, when everybody was going through this huge challenge with the Corona crisis, we also sort of started a COVID-19 challenge. A lot of industry professionals. I had joined the World Health Organization as an advisor to found, let's say, a small focus group, as it's called in the World Health Organization, to bring more visibility into how you can use artificial intelligence to solve problems like COVID, but also all other medical problems. And I was looking for some great visualization, actually, to understand and simplify what is COVID, because I'm not a epidemiologist or a virologist, so I was like, I need to understand it in the most simplest way. And I just actually had this thick book, Molecular Virology. So I did start reading it. It's still here. It's lying next to me. And it did teach me a lot. But what I wanted was for the audience to understand it in the most simplest way. And I found this amazing poster online. And then I think it was circulating all over the web. And so I quickly reached out to the creator, which is Avesta. And I said, hey, I would like to kind of use, with your permission, the poster that you've created to highlight what is COVID and how we want to solve COVID problem with its how it's sort of a degenerative disease and how it kind of literally sort of goes into the virus kind of starts destroying you at the cellular level. And she said, okay, sure. And then I kind of followed up with Avesta, and I said, hey, this is like awesome. And I saw her background, but I'm sure Avesta is going to give an introduction. So that's how I got in touch with Avesta. And today, obviously, if you just go to her website, which is up there on the link, you will see wonderful creations which she does in many different areas. So without much ado, I want to welcome Avesta. And Avesta is going to kind of introduce herself and take you into the journey through an example or two into this workshop. We're all going to listen. I'm going to also try to sort of enrich my knowledge listening to her. And then in the end, please do keep posting questions. Keep posting questions as they come. We will answer these questions. So without much ado, Avesta, welcome to this live workshop. I'm very happy to have you.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm happy to be here and to share a little bit of what I do, and hopefully you guys can learn a thing or two about data visualization and good design practices. So should I try and share
Sure,
my screen?
You can share a screen, absolutely. I will put it up on the. So while you're sharing a screen, just tell us a little bit about yourself, Avesta, where you grew up, or I know you're from University of Toronto, you did your master's there. So.
Yeah, so I'm formally or professionally trained as a biomedical animator and illustrator. So I attended the Masters of Biomedical Communications program at the University of Toronto, which is one of 4 accredited programs in medical illustration at the graduate level within North America, and the only one within Canada. So it's a very niche field, and it really, you take intensive art courses as well as intensive science courses to figure out the best way to communicate science to a specific audience. And that's, where I was trained. And now I'm working as a freelance biomedical animator and illustrator. So on the day-to-day, I typically collaborate with researchers or physicians, people in hospital and healthcare and academia to basically communicate their research through a variety of visuals. Like, for example, if they have a publication, I'll help create a figure for their publication. Or if there's a new surgical procedure, I'll create an animation to, educate other physicians on that procedure, things like that. So that's kind of where I play on a day-to-day basis.
And tell us a little bit about, you decided to go full blast and do your own, Azura Avesta. That's a wonderful name.
Yeah.
So how's that going?
So Avesta Design is my freelance business, and I've been doing that for almost 3 months now, maybe actually over 3 months. My sense of time is very off, but yeah, so it's been going great. Now as a freelancer, I get to collaborate with people in all sorts of different areas. So, I'm working with some researchers. I'm actually working with a researcher from Stanford who's doing COVID research, which is, super exciting.
Great.
And then I'm also, working with some people in the startup space doing specifically medtech startups, which, I can't dive into the details of those, but, it's interesting to learn about new medical devices that are going to be made available and things like that. And then I'm also collaborating with, an ophthalmologist who is, an eye surgeon he's always producing research on the best methods for different eye surgeries and things like that. So that's kind of what I've been doing over the past few months. And previously before that, previously before that, I was in industry working for a medical communications company, which is more pharma centered. So now I'm doing more so academia.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you for this background. Wonderful. So I guess you have your screen ready. Let me just pull it up.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay.
So just to have you kind of talk, I'll just minimize myself here. Yes, go ahead.
Alrighty. So today I'm going to talk about the art and science of data visualization. So I already introduced myself, so I won't go into detail here, but just something to add to what I already said. My background is in life sciences, so I went down the science route, and then I kept doing art on the side, and art and science was something I was always interested in since a very young age. And then when I discovered the M.Sc program at U of T, that's where I finally merged my two interests. So here's an example of the different kinds of work that I do. So, data visualization, which is, the topic for this talk, that's something that I do, as well as information visualization, which is different from data visualization in that, data viz is based off of data sets and usually numbers, whereas information visualization, it's, more so explaining a process or, a scientific phenomenon or, something that isn't necessarily based on numbers. And then I also do user interface design, editorial illustration, animation and 3D modeling, and 2D animation. So today I'm going to first start off by talking about data visualization and what it is, and then going into how you can implement data visualization in your own practices, and then show you an example of my work and how I use these practices within my work, as well as some resources that might be useful to you. So in this section, I'll be diving into the what, the why, the when, and the how of data visualization. So first of all, what is data visualization? So in a nutshell, it's the graphical representation of information and data using visual elements such as charts, graphs, and maps. But there's a bunch of different data visualization styles, which I'll get into a little bit later. So the first question is, why should you use it? If you're focused on the numbers, you might not think you need a visualization. But often, data visualization allows you to explore data sets in more creative ways. And doing that can help you identify new relationships, new trends, and patterns in the data that garner new insights. And then also, the visualization helps to emphasize the most important elements of your data. So instead of just presenting, a spreadsheet of numbers and data, picking out the most important aspects and emphasizing those are really effective in helping educate people and also effectively communicating your results to a specific audience. So when should you use it? So sometimes you don't actually need visualization, but when the problem isn't super well defined or you're kind of exploring more and you're not exactly sure what questions you're asking, that's a great time to use data visualization because, like I mentioned, it helps you realize new insights that maybe you wouldn't have noticed before. As well, if you need to present your data to a specific audience, data visualization is the most effective way to do that. And if there can be an educational outcome, if you're trying to educate rather than just instill action, this can be a great educational tool. And then lastly, and most importantly, if you have an end goal and you want change to come out of, say you have a data set on a specific problem and you want to solve this problem, highlighting the problem and your solution can motivate people to action. So I'm going to talk about 6 specific lessons that can help you tell your data story. And these are adapted from a book called Storytelling with Data by Cole Knaflic. So I'll include the link or the details of that at the end with the resources. But essentially, this author breaks it down into 6 major steps. So understanding the context of your data and then telling a story with it, which is probably the most important part. And then selecting a data visualization type. And then once you do that, eliminating clutter and cleaning up your design, focusing attention using salience, and thinking like a designer in general. So first of all, understanding the context. So this is the low tech stage, when you step away from the computer and you're really trying to brainstorm and ideate what you want to accomplish with your data. So during this stage, you really need to ask yourself, who is the audience and what do you want the audience to do with this data? What's the end goal? And how are you going to communicate your point to them? So for who the audience is, ask yourself questions like, what is their level of familiarity with the topic? Are they experts? Are they novices? Are they stakeholders in the company? Are they customers? What is your relationship to them? And also, with this in mind, you need to establish trust, or do they already know you? Do they already trust you and your interpretation of your data? So these are all important questions to ask. And then asking yourself what you need them to do. So this really helps you to determine the needs and the goals that you're trying to accomplish. Is there a specific outcome you're trying to achieve here? Or are you trying to educate rather than motivate? So you need to figure out, what is your end goal and what does the audience need to take away from this? And then lastly, the how. So how are you going to communicate it? Is it going to be a slide deck? Is it going to be a report? Is it going to be, a printed poster? There's so many different ways you can present information, and this will help you figure out how to show it. And then also, establishing your narrative tone. So what is the topic? Is it a lighthearted topic? Is it a heavy topic? Are you celebrating a success, or are you celebrating a failure? Or not celebrating a failure. Are you learning from a failure and want to change something as a result of it? So you have to figure out, what's the tone for presenting this information? And then also just an important note in general, which I'm sure all of you already know, but it's to, be objective in your tone and your narrative and, devoid of bias. You don't want to eliminate certain data and then mislead your audience. So you have to be careful with this as well.
Yeah.
And then once you understand all those different aspects, then that informs the context of your data story. And then, usually in this stage, when I'm figuring out all these things, this is when I'm literally writing with pen and paper on a page. And I think that's, the best way to brainstorm. And, sticky notes is another method a lot of people use, or a whiteboard, or now because lots of people are doing remote collaboration, you can use like a virtual whiteboard or something like that to just kind of scribble out your ideas for all of these questions.
Yeah.
And then once you understand that, you move on to the telling a story part, which is kind of the more fun and interesting section. So, in general, humans are storytellers. We remember stories way better than we remember numbers. And, stories are what motivate us to actually take action and to change things. They inspire us. So you might recognize this graph from good old high school English class. So, the narrative arc is a very basic concept, but it is the backbone of any good story. So
Yeah.
a good story has a clear beginning, middle, and end. So the beginning is, the introduction, the exposition, you're introducing your characters and the setting. And then the middle is when you build tension. So you have your rising action, the events that are occurring. And that leads to the climax, which is the turning point of the story. And then the falling action brings it to the resolution. And to talk about that in more data-centric terms, so beginning then becomes your introduction to the topic, and the middle is when you explain the problem that you're trying to solve with your data and explain the scope of the problem. So this is where you're really building the tension and you're making the audience want to understand, why are you trying to solve this and why should we solve it? And then the climax is your results. So your solution. You present your solution, and then once you do this, you have to interpret them, explain them, and that is, the falling action. And that leads you to the call to action or the resolution. So, you don't just show your results and that's it. You have to explain to people, what do you want them to do with your results? What is the end goal? And that's super important. And because of that, repetition is a great storytelling device. So another effective technique is to bring the call to action to the very beginning. So let's say you're putting together a report based on some data analysis, having like a banner at the beginning explaining exactly what you want the audience to get out of this often engages them right off the get-go. And then you dive into the explanation and describing the scope. And then at the end, when you bring them back to that initial part, they remember and then they put it all together in their heads. So moving on to selecting a data visualization type. So I'm not going to dive too much into detail on this one because this can be its own presentation. But basically, the goal of a data visualization is to reduce cognitive load. So you want people to remember what you're doing and what you're trying to teach them. And so basically you want to minimize the amount of mental effort it takes them to understand your data visualization, which can also be called maximizing the signal to noise ratio. So the signal is the message you're trying to get across, and the noise is everything else that doesn't, amplify your main message. So you really want to increase that signal so that your message gets across. And then, different data viz types, they show different relationships and different trends. So you want to have like an exploratory phase where you try out different visualizations to see what garners the most interesting insights. And then also, people often forget that text is a form of data visualization. Text has a lot of content too. So, utilize text to support your visualizations. If you have a graph showing something, a one-line summary of that with text can really get that message across. So this is an example of some different data visualization types. And I took this from the DataViz project by Ferdio, which is an information design agency. And they outlined really well. This is just a screenshot of a few. There's like a whole web page filled with them. And they organize it based on family, based on input, based on the function you're trying to achieve. So, selecting your data style is really important. And, I'm not going to teach you how to do this because this is, there's a lot that goes behind it, but utilizing resources like the database project, I find is really helpful. And then moving on to eliminating clutter. So there's a lot of psychology behind how we, interpret design and objects on a page. So every element you add, that increases the mental effort to process that image. So you want to be mindful of your design choices and make sure you're removing any extraneous content. Or, a good example of this is, often you'll see a table or something like that, and it'll have like super thick black borders that distract from the actual numbers or the data in the table. So you want to, emphasize the data, not the graphic elements that surround them. So, some examples of this, there's something called the Gestalt principles of visual perception, which, in a psychology study back in the day, they basically figured out how people perceive, design, objects on a page and things like that. So I won't go super into detail, but basically how you see the way things are grouped together, if they're close together, you're going to perceive them as being in a group. Or, if there's something that looks like a shape that we're familiar with, even if it's not that shape and it's broken lines or whatnot, we're going to perceive it as being what we already know. And obviously similarity, so use of color and shapes. If you have the same color, people are going to think that's part of a group. If you enclose things in boxes, people are going to think that's part of a group. And then, we naturally put things in the foreground or in the background based on how they're laid out. And, symmetry, that basically creates a sense of order on a page. And common fate basically refers to if things are moving or there's implied movement, you're going to perceive that as being a group as well. So moving on, also a really huge thing with eliminating clutter is the use of white space. So often people forget about white space because they're just thinking about the content, not what's surrounding the content on the page. And white space it's like taking a breath when you're talking. You don't want to listen to someone rambling on with no breaks. Including white space is like when you're reading a page, you see a spot of white space and you take a break from reading. So it allows you to organize the information and to give breathing room so it's not overwhelming. And then also, ensuring proper alignment is an obvious one because you want things to be easily legible. And then focusing attention. So this is specifically using salience, which is the quality by which an observable thing stands out relative to the environment. So you want to direct your audience's attention using these different properties. And, this is just an example of 5. There's way more than this. But, using color, using different shapes, different styles, moving things to different areas on the page, the position, as well as the size. These can draw attention to the elements on your page. And then color is, a huge one. Color is really what makes something pop, but you want to use it sparingly. You don't want to go crazy with color. So you also, for example, on the left-hand side, you can see, different shades of blue will get the same message across and will be much more visually pleasing than using rainbow colors. And then also utilizing contrast. So contrast is basically how much something stands out compared to another thing. And this increases legibility. So if you have, text on top of a different color, you want to make sure it's still legible. So the top example are good examples of contrast, and the bottom is bad examples of contrast. And there's a web tool that you can use to input images, and it'll measure the contrast for you and tell you if it's good or not. And I'll include this in the resources later. And then
Wonderful.
Color blindness. So a lot of people are actually colorblind, and it's easy to forget about this if you're not colorblind, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. And there's lots of simulators online that can simulate color blindness. So when you're designing, just bear that in mind as well. And lastly, colors can have different cultural meanings. So the color red is a great example because it means so many different things. So, in Russia, they associate red with revolution and communism. And then in China, it just symbolizes luck and prosperity. And then in the West, it's associated with love and passion. And then in India, it's associated with spirituality. In Africa, it's negative and it's associated with death. So you want to be careful with, based on your audience, are you using colors that aren't going to offend them or give a different kind of meaning? Yeah, and then lastly, thinking like a designer. So with this section, it's really talking about how form follows function. So function is, what you want your audience to do with your data. It's the end goal. So the form is the visuals that support this end goal. Your message doesn't support the visuals. The visuals support the message. So just always reminding yourself of this. I won't go super into depth into these examples, but affordances are basically just design elements that make it explicit how you should interpret and read something. So basically just, in visual hierarchy, highlighting important information, things like that. And then making it accessible. So I talked about color blindness. If you're presenting it, auditory disabilities, include captions if you're, doing something auditory. Also consider, people from different backgrounds. If you're presenting this to a group, they likely have different educational backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, so it should be understandable to all of them. And then lastly, if you can, implement user testing or just user feedback. So, whether you're just bouncing it off your friends or colleagues, or if you have a formal user testing session, this is a user experience design principle, and it's really useful in getting, the best result from whatever your product is. And of course, if you get feedback, implement the feedback and keep iterating. So lastly, I want to finish off these lessons with some examples of some really great designers who I follow for inspiration in data visualization. And their websites are here. You take a screenshot. I'll make the slides will be presented available afterwards. So if you ever need some data visualization inspiration, these are some great go-tos. So now I'm going to show my COVID project and how I've used these principles in the creation of my COVID infographic.
Awesome. Do we want to, let's take a few questions. I think that becomes interactive.
Yeah.
So let me, okay. Yeah. So I thought I captured a couple questions here. Oh yeah, here you go. The first question is, and you could read it yourself and see what is the advice you would want to give to Sai.
Best sources to acquire knowledge on visualization tools. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are some really great books on data visualization, and I actually include these in the end. So I think we'll get to your question later in the presentation, but there are some books that I'll recommend. There's also tons of websites on data visualization. It's a little bit overwhelming to sort through them all, but Google is super useful in that sense. There's also tons of data visualization studios that often have examples of the process in their work. Some that I personally like are Accurate and Ferdio. I mentioned they have the DataViz project. Looking at data visualization studios helps you figure out what's the industry standard for data visualization.
Perfect.
And in terms of software and programs, I'm not a data analyst, so I don't know all the programs, but I know Tableau is a software that I've used before for creating data visualizations. You could use Excel. Is not the most ideal one, but Excel is another one. Python. I'm sure there's others. If anyone else knows of other software, please comment it in the comment section.
Perfect. Go ahead. Let's take the rest of the questions in the end.
Okay. So diving into the process for this piece. Okay. So first, to identify the problem. This was back in March when I decided I wanted to create this piece, and that was when COVID was declared a global pandemic, and there was a crazy amount of information being released every single day on COVID. And for the average person, it's really exhausting to keep up with the information. People often don't have the energy or the scientific background to understand all the information that was coming out. And misinformation was a huge problem at the beginning. So this was one of the main problems. And then the second is I noticed a communication gap. So there was not very much visual media on how it affected the body back in late March. So with my specific skill set, I figured I could help fill this communication gap. And at the time there was a lot of visualizations of the virus itself, like the 3D model and the structure of the virus, but there wasn't anything about how it actually is affecting your lungs or your body. So that was kind of the topic for this piece. And then, once I knew I wanted to do that, I needed to figure out who was the audience, who was I catering this to. And because of the fact that this is a global pandemic, I wanted it to be accessible to as many people as possible, so a really wide general public. And then, because it's a scientific topic, having a high school level education or above is kind of, I would say, required for understanding this piece. And then what I wanted the audience to do with this final infographic, I wanted them to understand the effects of COVID so that they know the importance of taking the preventative measures to prevent themselves and others from getting infected. So it was kind of a two-part. I wanted to educate, and I wanted to motivate them to take action. And then how? So to accomplish these goals, I thought the best way to get this message across would be through a one-page infographic, so that you only have to look on a single page. You don't have to scroll through many pages, because then you're going to lose your audience's attention. And social media is a great way to share information. Things can spread super fast on social media, so I was going to use that as my outlet. And specifically, Twitter has more of a academic following, so Twitter was going to be my main point of posting this, versus Instagram, where I have more artistic followers versus academics.
Exactly.
And then lastly, for how I wanted to communicate it, I wanted to make it accessible on my website as well, so that people could download it for free and share it as well. So once that was all established, I then went on to sketching and figuring out, what my story is going to be. So I did tons of research. I, took lots of screenshots of current visualizations on pneumonia and what was in research journals on COVID, and basically jotted out a bunch of information and then tried to distill this down into the most important information. So on the right, you can see some of my really early sketches, which are like super scribbly and hard to even read. But this is how projects start. You scribble out your ideas. You think of different ways you can tell your story. And then here are just some other sketches. So I start with just sketching out different components in no cohesive order. And then once I know the components, I can start to organize them on a page. So you can see these are some early thumbnail sketches where I'm playing with layout, and the layout informs the flow of your story. So here you can see I started with 4, and then I narrowed that down to 2 main layouts. And then after I narrowed that down to 2, I then decided on one final layout that I thought best told the story. And so the ultimate goal of this piece, just to reiterate, was to inform the public on the evidence-based research on COVID-19, to motivate them to take the preventative actions. So in this story, the main character is the coronavirus. It's the enemy in this story. So you had to introduce the characters, and why is this important? What is it doing to you? And why should you care about it? So that's kind of the story I wanted to focus on. And then, so here is just the next iteration of my layout. And then to show you the flow of my story, here you can see the top left is the introduction. That's where I introduce the topic. I show you where it's happening. The setting is the lungs, and the character is the coronavirus. And then I go into the rising action to build tension. So I describe, I go from a healthy alveolus, which is, the air sacs in the lungs. I go from a healthy alveolus and show the progression to a severely infected one and how it leads to pneumonia. So I'm building the tension, like, oh, look at all these processes happening in your body. And then I dive into, why should you care? What is the impact of this? And that's the clinical section where I talk about, you get pneumonia, you develop these symptoms, you might end up in the ICU, and, in the worst case scenarios, it can lead to death. So clearly this is really important. And I want you to understand that, this has severe risks, and you should, as a result, the so what section, take actions to prevent this from happening. So that's, the narrative arc of my story, and you can see how I laid that out on the page there. And then, so for this one, it's not really a traditional data visualization. There's no charts and graphs. However, the data viz type in this case is illustrated diagrams. That is still a form of data visualization. And also the use of text. So I use text to enforce certain concepts. So, if this was a more data viz intensive one, if it was a report, you might have a bunch of graphs and charts, but the concept is the same. You're still laying it out on a page and telling a story with it. And then to eliminate clutter. So I used a grid-based system to organize my page so that, the reader would be directed based on, the spacing between elements. So here you can see explicit reading order as a result of my layout. So, you start in the upper left because, at least if you're from a Western country, you read left to right. So you start in the upper left, you can see the flow of information goes down and then it ends. So you're like, okay, where do I go next? And you see, oh, healthy is at the top. It must start healthy and then go to severe. So then go healthy down to severe. And then you read kind of across the bottom and then notice, oh, there's this other section. I'm going to read that. And then lastly, the last section that's kind of blocked off on the right is the impact, or the so what section. That's the last thing. And then here's just some couple graphic examples of how I minimize clutter. So you can see on the left, there's some cells there that were taking up unnecessary room because I also explained the cells in the little bubbles. So it was redundant. So I took those out and then, established more of the story in text. And then in the lower left, you can see the impaired gas exchange text box. I broke that up into different sections instead of just having a chunk of text. And then in the what you can do section, I had some overlapping numbers and then text, which I think were confusing from a graphic standpoint. So then I spaced those out to increase the white space. So little things that are, they seem minor, but when you implement a lot of these changes, it leads to a more clean overall product. And then to focus attention. So here's the final thing. And you can see that, I think the use of color is the most obvious example for this one. And, I reinforce that where you are with the color of pink. So you see the lungs are pink. And then you see, oh, these alveoli are pink. They must be in the lungs. And then you see on the little bubbles, the insets, you see, oh, there's also a little pink bubble there. That must be the alveolus. So, I'm constantly reinforcing where you are with the use of color. And then you also see healthy down to severe. Each one of those labels are a different color, and those correspond with the clinical section where I have the progression from symptoms from, less worrisome symptoms to the most severe symptoms. Those correspond with healthy to severe. So, using use of color, use of shape. So I repeat that alveolus shape so that you understand that it's the same structure. And grouping. So, grouping elements together. You can see that, the healthy alveolus inset is grouped with the drawing on the left and, so on. And then lastly, thinking like a designer. So just some things that I kept in mind when I was designing this piece. I wanted to highlight important information. So, just going back for a second, you can see that, in the immune response, I bolded certain words, or in the gas exchange, carbon dioxide is red and corresponds with the red arrow on the left. Little things like that just to highlight important information. Using white space, which I already talked about, to, using the white space in the layout to imply reading direction and a visual hierarchy. And then making it accessible. So I wanted this to be as accessible as possible. So I wanted to post it publicly on my website as well as on social media. And I use a Creative Commons license so that it could be shared without people worrying about, copyright issues. And then also, it was translated into 16 languages. So now it's accessible to different cultures and people who can't understand English. Yeah. So, and that wasn't even an end goal. That happened after I posted it, which is amazing. And then also in the text, I avoided talking about cultural opinions or religious opinions. I only used evidence-based research because I didn't want to talk about an opinion that then was later proved to be wrong.
Correct.
And then lastly, so I didn't do formal user testing, but I sent it to multiple friends that I had within academia so that they could read over it, proofread and, make sure it made sense to them. And then also after I posted it on Twitter, people commented with some suggestions or maybe some research that I didn't fully explain. And I made more edits based on what the public said on social media.
Yeah.
And then I updated that on my website. So I think there was like maybe 8 different iterations in the end of this piece. Yeah, you're constantly trying to improve something. And then lastly, this is kind of a bonus step. So if you have the ability and the time to measure the success of your product, then that's ideal, of course. And that's, you can implement data analytics in this step as well. So, for this piece, and this is what shows you the impact. So, the fact that it was shared by the World Economic Forum, who has almost 3 million followers on LinkedIn alone. And then within the week following me posting this, this little map in the middle shows the views on my website. So my website had like under 100 views before this. Like it was not very high. And then after this, like within a week, it was at over 15,000 views. And you can see the map, it's all over the world. So that was really like striking to me. It's like, wow, like this is actually being used across the world. Like I must have succeeded in my mission. And then, it's just seeing people's shares and comments on Twitter reinforces that, it's having the educational impact that you wanted. And then on Twitter alone, this got over 2 million views. So, that reinforces that, you accomplished the goal. And then lastly, this was shared with a physician who was a specialist in, respiratory sciences. And he specifically said that the science was accurate and that people could actually understand it, and that he would want to share it with his own patients who are, asthmatic, and some of them had COVID-19. So the fact that a specialist in this field wanted to share it with his patients, reinforces the fact that it was a success. So, if you can measure success, that's always a great bonus step to include. And then lastly, just to summarize all these steps again. So, understanding the context, the who, the what, the how of your audience, and, that informs the story that you're going to tell. And then selecting a data visualization type, and then eliminating clutter, making the page nice and clean, focusing attention with, different design principles, like using salience, like color, position, size, shape, those elements. And then lastly, thinking like it's a designer, testing things, iterating things, always trying to improve the product. And then lastly, if you want to add an additional step of measuring the success, then that's a great step to add. And then the resources page that I promised to share.
Yeah, I know, guys. Folks are really excited to kind of see how did she bring this all together. Let me get my hands on those books.
Yeah, no, I specifically, I really went through the Storytelling with Data book very thoroughly. That's a great resource, and it's very, it's not too wordy. It's very understandable. Then there's also visualization, analysis, and design. I didn't have the chance to read through that, but I was recommended it by people within the AI and ML fields. So I trust their judgment on that book. And then in doing research, I also discovered Nancy Duarte, who's a communication specialist, and she has a book called Resonate, which talks about putting the audience at the center of your story. And you always have to bring it back to the audience. Who are you doing this for? Why are you doing it for them? So this book helps you understand that. And then Data Story, I believe, is quite similar to the Storytelling with Data book. And actually, Cole Knaflick refers to this book within her book. So that's another great resource. And then lastly, just some additional design resources that I use. So if you're not good at coming up with color palettes or color theory, because that does take quite a bit of training, colorhunt.co is a great resource where they just have examples of swatches and color palettes, and you can, if you want a spring themed color palette, you can just look up spring and it'll give you colors and things like that. And then to measure contrast, so I mentioned having a good contrast in colors. There's contrastchecker.com where you can import an image and it will tell you if the contrast is actually good. And then a color blindness simulator. Usually if you just Google color blindness simulator, you can find so many examples of this, but I just included one here that I use. And then for finding fonts, I like to use Google Fonts personally because they have many examples that are free for download. And they also have examples of how to pair titles with body text. And then lastly, the DataViz project that I mentioned from Ferdio, there is a link for it, datavizproject.com, and they have a huge amount of DataViz types, and it's really educational. You can select a DataViz type, and it'll bring you to a new page and explain to you when you should use it, why you should use this type, like what are the kind of inputs you would use for showing that. So yeah, I hope those are helpful, and then I'll open up the floor for questions now.
Great. I think first of all, instead of me obviously I'm super excited. I've been watching your work for a few months now. We've been having a lot of conversations offline. I watched you transform into someone who was dabbling with these visualizations to going full gung-ho. And I'm so happy to hear with the other ventures, some are, I guess, startups, and others going into academia or bearing their fruits, and that gives me tremendous pleasure in seeing how professionals with the right skills are able to succeed. But instead of obviously me thanking you, I was just kind of posting what other people were saying. For example, the journey of bringing it all together. As Mehnaz says, I think I couldn't have said it better. That's a story as well. The storytelling of storytelling. That's what you did. I think this really helps a lot of people, including myself. I don't see myself as either a visually expert person or understanding colors. Professionals like yourselves who combine visualization and communication in this field is fascinating. And I think the one thing that I would say before I jump onto the questions is what I see is that where some visualization experts fail is others, and I see others succeed, is how to move from attention to immersion. And I'm just a consumer. I can only see how it works on me as a consumer. I get a lot of attention from all over the place. People do a lot of interesting things. For example, there is this actually a fascinating a physicist on Twitter. I'm sure you may have seen her tweets as well. Right now, she's comparing the dresses, which what's her name of that singer? I keep forgetting the name.
Taylor Swift.
Yeah, Taylor Swift with the physics books. Yeah. So,
yeah, I saw that.
The thing is, to me, that reaches a certain level, but it stops at that. It doesn't excite me to learn that book. I think what I saw in this was, in your visualization, I went from attention, it grabbed my attention. I mean, I was looking for something, I found it. And then I went into immersion. So like I said, I have this 850-page book on molecular virology. I read through it. with great pleasure once I knew where to go into, which sections to go for. And I could go after those sections because I had seen in your visualization. So I think I really could immerse myself into the story, even not even knowing you. When I saw this poster, it helped me tremendously. And today we are about to publish our research on COVID-19, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. It's a multi-country research with, Iran, Germany, Canada, Brazil, and a few other countries' data. All right, so I think this is fascinating. I mean, I'm so glad that I've sort of, we have you in this chat. Let me just kind of start grabbing questions right from the top, and let's see if I can gather.
I mean, kind of to answer your own, thoughts on attention versus immersion, just to, quickly outline what I think the really big differences and how you move from attention to immersion. Attention is usually visual based. You see a visual, it's striking, you're like, oh, it grabs your attention because it looks cool. And then you interpret it further and you say, okay, what is this visual trying to show? And if the content isn't interesting to you, you're going to lose attention. So you can think it looks amazing and it looks cool, but if the content isn't, justified, if it doesn't explain the impact, like with the, Taylor Swift dresses compared to physics books, it looks cool. It's like, oh, her dress matches the book. That looks fun. But then it's like, oh, that's it. There's no meaning behind it. Whereas with the COVID infographic, for example, it's like, oh, look at those pretty colors. And then you read it and you're like, oh, this is actually interesting. I'm learning something. So, that's really the big difference, I think, is the visuals and the content.
Yeah, exactly. And I know I saw on your website, I'm seeing it sort of, I'm literally have to keep a track on it on a weekly basis because you're adding some really fascinating content. I already love the way when you enter your website, azureavesta.com, I think it's you sitting there, right? And then through your computer, it kind of sort of, you're literally sort of taking the universe and understanding it. I think you definitely know how to do this. And I mean, to our audience, I'm very sort of thrilled to also pull Avesta also into our live AI platform, in which data visualization is one big massive track. We're going to be launching a trainings and Avesta, and we need to do the paperwork, I know. But I think I can't, with your permission, kind of say that, I will be more than happy to at least to kind of have you teach our audience as well once we launch this online, because there are very, very few visualization experts. To be, with all respect to everybody who's doing wonderful job out there, there are some other ladies I've seen have also done some wonderful stuff out there. Is that you need to have people to be able to learn something. And if visualization can help me not only grab my attention, but help me immerse in it and eventually help me decide. For example, one of the users here already, this channel, said, well, I think I love this field. I want to go into visualization the way she's doing it. And if you can learn some art, whether it's astrophysics or whether it's biology, virology, I think then you've really succeeded in your job as a visualization expert. So I think you'll do really well. And here's the question from Gaurav.
Yeah, so how do you figure out what would be a better alternative for a particular graph type? Yeah, so I mean, I'm not a data expert. I'm not going to claim to be one. So for me, this is also a great question because, when I was designing my planetary satellites and data visualization piece, because it was more, data centric versus information centric, what I did to figure out the best kind of graph is I literally, I had my Excel spreadsheet with all my numbers and my data. I brought that into Tableau, and maybe you're using a different software to actually produce your charts and graphs. And then literally just try different types of graphs. Obviously there's, statistics behind things, and, if depending on what you're trying to accomplish, this is really important. But for my sake, it was more so of a visual exercise. So what I was doing is, I was putting different things on different axes and seeing if there was relationships between certain variables that I maybe wouldn't have thought of on my own. And, also just visualizing things like if you're looking for, like, for my piece, I was trying to compare the sizes of different moons in the solar system. And, obviously, if you're talking about size, the best way to show that is actually to show size differences rather than showing like a table or like a grouped bar chart or something of like, oh, this is the size. You want to physically show the size. So I did a bubble chart where I had like a bunch of different bubbles showing the sizes of moons. So, what you're trying to accomplish informs the kind of data viz you should use. And I don't want to go too much in depth in this because I'll probably say something that's not true because I'm not I did never have to take I didn't do any stats courses or anything like that. So, I don't understand it from that perspective, but there's tons of resources online that do this. And, like I mentioned, the DataViz project, there's also other databases that explain when to use different visualizations and, if it's effective in communicating your point.
Perfect. Here is a question from Amanda too. So this is really also my question, actually. What are those tools? I know there are some advanced visualization tools. From a data science or AI perspective, there are some very simple tools. I'm sure you've heard of in university also, or with your clients. In data science, you use Matplotlib, Seaborn, Tableau, to a certain extent, Power BI, a bunch of other tools for different vendors. I know for medicine and 3D visualization, I've used in the past tools like VTK and Maya AVI kind of tools. Those are sort of 3D visualization tools. So to me, I'm also interested in what is it that sort of helps Avesta sit on, and what does she use? An iPad, and then is she sketching? We saw that you scribbled a lot on a paper. So what are those programs and software you use?
Yeah, so, I always start on paper. It's, for me, the easiest way to get my ideas on a page. And other than that, once I scribble things on paper, I'll usually bring that into my iPad, and I'll use an application called Procreate for any kind of digital sketching or digital painting. So, it's very similar to Photoshop. But, I personally found that it was, very intuitive to use compared to Photoshop. And so that's what I use for my digital painting. And then once I painted those out in Procreate, then I exported it as like a PNG and brought that into Adobe Illustrator, where I laid everything out. I added the text, I added arrows and graphic elements. I would say Adobe Illustrator is probably the program I use the most. Like, I always, if it's any kind of still image, I'll always bring things into Adobe Illustrator to add text and organize layout. But, if I am doing a 3D project, I do use a combination of ZBrush, which is like a virtual sculpting program where you sculpt clay in 3D. And then I'll bring that into Autodesk Maya to animate it. And then I use Arnold as the renderer. And then I will composite it in Adobe After Effects, as well as Premiere sometimes. So that's more of my 3D workflow. But yeah, for this one, cool. Procreate and Adobe Illustrator, that was it. Very simple.
Awesome. Lauren has a question. It's practical question around clients' expectations, I guess. So what's, you can read your question yourself.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, there's no clear answer for how long it takes me. Something like, so the COVID one that I made, I was making that outside of work hours. But, with that in mind, I think it took me around 2, maybe 3 weeks to finish the whole thing. So if you add up I don't know the exact number of hours that I did, but it was well over 30 hours. And I often find that, the research stage takes almost as long as the design stage, because you have to do a lot of reading, a lot of interpreting and planning. So I would say almost 40% to 50% of the time is dedicated to understanding the topic and figuring out the story, versus, actually drawing it. And then in terms of communicating with clients, so It depends on the project sometimes, and it depends on the client. If it's research that is currently being produced, there's usually a lot more, excuse me, iterations,
Yeah.
because maybe they're writing their manuscript at the same time and making the image, and they're like, oh, I want to add this and I want to add that. So in that case, it's more fluid. But typically, what I'll do if it's more streamlined, I'll give a client two major periods of revision. So one after the initial sketch, or thumbnail sketches where I play around with different layouts, and then one after. Actually, I guess it would be three periods. One after the refined sketch, where I I clean up the images, I clean up the layout, and I confirm that this is how they want it to look. And then once that's confirmed, I'll move on to actually rendering it. So I'll add color, I'll make it pretty, and then they'll have a chance to review it after that. Because if they don't like the colors, or if they don't like the visuals, then I'll tweak some things. So usually it's 2 to 3 revision periods.
I guess the last question, which is probably anybody who's here on will probably be asking, is this. So I kind of just highlight this question as well. Some people are really inspired and ignited.
Yeah, that's great. So you can contact me, through LinkedIn. I'll respond to messages on LinkedIn, as well as Twitter. If you at me on Twitter, I'll usually respond, as well as through my website, azuravesta.com. You can, actually, maybe I'll write my website in the chat. So if you go on my website, you can see that I have a contact form where it'll send an email to me, and then I can respond to you via email. And
Great.
I just sent my, oh, I see you put it in there as well. Great.
Yeah. Awesome. And you see and for the audience, we have sort of put up Avesta's website on both LinkedIn and YouTube. So do please reach out to her if you have your own inspiration you want to share with her, and potentially maybe you might be some really interesting project. You can come up together, either learn from her, work with her, maybe come up with some commercial project that'll help her or help you as well. And that's why we do these workshops. So first of all, thank you so much, Avesta. I'm really happy to have had this conversation in which I saw you also as a professional sort of telling us and teaching all of us. I do remember this, from the storytelling with the excitement, anticipation, climax, and then resolution. I remember even in consulting, I used to be in consulting a couple of years ago. We used to have actors, as in, theater actors and folks like us, to come and teach us, because when you're a consultant, you can tend to get just too lost in just data and facts and other sort of aspects, and just totally forget who you're doing it for. So we had to act, and those, actors who have actually trained, even film actors, for the last 20, 30 years, they trained us, telling us how the storytelling is such an important thing to do. So really thankful, super grateful that, in your education, you learned this art, which is so important in any and every field in the industry. And sometimes, unfortunately, forgotten, because people don't realize how important it is to help people, remember and retain information. So this is really great. Thank you so much. And I guess we're very happy to sort of, you guys will hear from Avesta once we start launching our live AI in data visualization. There's going to be a few, I guess, programs in which it will sort of, take the lead and give you guys a much better perspective. It'll be a paid program. We'll make sure that we're going to launch this in the next couple of weeks. So thank you very much, Avesta. Hang on. You and I can just go get off the, I guess, leave the studio, but you and I can just have a wrap-up chat. For everybody else on internet, on LinkedIn and YouTube, thank you once again. Awesome. Excited that you kind of stuck to this hour. We saw, I was just checking the number of people were pretty maxing out at 65, 70. Lots of people jumped in. So this is great, actually. Just on LinkedIn, I didn't follow. I think on YouTube, there were also similar numbers. Thanks, everybody. And we hope to hear from you guys soon again. Thanks. Thank you, Avesta.
Thank you so much.